for folks to tune in. Looking forward to the conversation. For those just joining, we're just waiting for a few more folks to tune in. We've got a great turnout here, and we will launch here in the next 30 seconds or so. So with that, a very warm welcome to all. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today from wherever you are. My name is Brian Finlay, and I have the honor of serving as President and CEO of the Stimson Center. For those of you that are familiar with our work, you will know that for more than 3 decades, Stimson has applied something of a unique approach to meeting threats to our common security and prosperity. We have gone and continue to go beyond simply admiring the problem. All of our work, all of it, is designed to move the needle of public policy. It is what our guest of honor today, as well as our namesake, might call pragmatic steps toward ideal objectives. And the work that we are going to discuss today is no different. We're going to have a lot of fun here today. You might say that our roots are showing. Not only are we getting back to an issue upon which the Stimson Center was really founded some 30 years ago, but we're doing so with our 2 co-founders, who I hope will not only reflect upon the rise and fall of arms control strategies as what has been a really indispensable, I think, tool in America's security arsenal, but in the spirit of Henry Stimson himself, I hope that they might help guide us on a practical path forward, adapting what has worked, I think, so well for America and the world in the past as we face the evolving security landscape today. So here is our order of battle here today. It's with pleasure that I will introduce you shortly to Dr. Barry Blackmon. Barry, as many of you know, was founder and longtime CEO of DFI International. He had previously served in various capacities, including the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency at the State Department. Michael Crapon, are you old enough to remember ACTA? Barry also served at the Pentagon, at the White House, as well as what I consider to be an array of lesser think tanks, Barry, here in Washington, D.C., before co-founding the Stimson Center with Michael Crapon in 1989. So Barry is going to give us some brief remarks to really set the stage before we turn to Michael, who will give us the quick Cliff's Notes version of his new work. And I really do commend it to you. We are going to make that available for those of you in the chat. You can click on a link and purchase the book, and I really encourage you to do so. We're also then very fortunate to be joined by Joan Rolfing. Joan, of course, serves as President and Chief Operating Officer at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and that comes following her own quite remarkable career in public service at the Pentagon, Department of Energy, at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, as well as in various capacities on Capitol Hill. And you know, it's normally trite to say this, but in Joan's case, it is absolutely true. I really can't think of no one better qualified to question some of Michael's assumptions and to help us to generate a really good discussion here today. So grateful, Joan, for you joining us. Thank you. But with that, Dr. Blackmon, I'm going to turn the virtual dais over to you, sir.
Thank you. It's an honor, actually, and a pleasure, certainly, to introduce or to set the stage for my longtime friend and partner, Michael Crapon. I do want to take just 1 minute to note a sad passing. Peter Zimmerman, who many of you must have known, a physicist who devoted his life to arms control, passed last August. I read in the Post only yesterday, actually. Peter was one of the people who toiled in the vineyards for many years, like many of us have, and he was relentless in his work for arms control and his determination that good could come of that work. So I just like to remember him for a moment. And now let me turn to a birth of a wonderful new book by Michael Crapon. Michael and I, our friendship was born in arms control. We actually worked together initially at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and became friends. And not that long after that, established the Stimson Center together. Michael ran the place. I kind of sat on the sidelines and raised money and gave some advice once in a while. And Stimson's focus in the early days was on arms control. That was our initial focus. Our agenda is far broader today. But under Michael's leadership in the 90s, Stimson accomplished amazing things. There was the Open Skies Treaty, which I think Michael invented and then brought into being soon thereafter. It was Stimson that organized the arms control community to work together on a common agenda during the run-up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference that led to its permanent extension. Stimson led the fight to ratify the Chemical Weapons Treaty during this period, again under Michael's leadership, and finally to get the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, if not ratified, at least signed and in effect for many years now, even without formally going into effect. So Michael and Stimson had and still have a wonderful record in promoting arms control. And Michael has documented not just our work, but the far broader field and the work of many others in this wonderful new book, which I commend to all of you. And with that, I will turn over the stage to Michael Crapon.
You know, the Stimson Center wouldn't exist without Barry Blackmon. And Barry brought to the table a lot more than he suggested. A tremendous business sense, tremendous policy entrepreneurship, which he neglected to add to his introductory remarks. The ability to read a balance sheet, some of the basics to institution building that I didn't have. And it's been such a privilege to work with him, to get periodic boosts from him, to establish this place where that Brian runs so effectively, where people are granted the gift of meaningful work. And they go out in the world after Stimson. It's just a wonderful thing to have co-created Stimson with you, Barry. My book is about rise, demise, and revival. Something quite extraordinary happened during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union had so many close calls. These two nations competed fiercely. Together, we and a few other countries manufactured over 125,000 nuclear weapons, if you can believe that. And not one of them became a mushroom cloud on a battlefield. This by itself was the most unacknowledged diplomatic achievement during the Cold War. And yet arms control, which had so much to do with this, gets no respect. A lot of people think, and still think, that deterrence, we have deterrence to thank for so much. Well, deterrence did contribute to this record of non-use in warfare. But deterrence needed help. Deterrence by itself is dangerous. It's supposed to be dangerous. It's supposed to be threatening. Otherwise, it doesn't deter. And the United States and the Soviet Union in the past, and 4 pairings of nuclear armed rivals in the present, are still strengthening deterrence by making it more threatening, because it doesn't deter unless it threatens. That is the very nature of deterrence. The very nature of arms control is different. And it's hard to understand. But think of it this way. Deterrence created wretched excess in the nuclear space. Arms control reduced it by a rather significant percentage, over 80%. Deterrence produced about 2,000 nuclear tests, and every test was really an advertisement for nuclear weapons utility. And arms control stopped those tests. Around 700 of them were in the atmosphere. A great threat to public health. But they were needed, we were told, for deterrence. Arms control had a very different idea. Deterrence alone didn't create the norm that we live by, which is a norm of not using weapons on battlefields. Now, I know this norm isn't written in treaty form that nuclear armed rivals adhere to. And I know this norm isn't written into many doctrinal statements about nuclear deterrence, but the norm exists. It's over 7 decades old. How did it happen? It didn't happen merely by threatening. It happened by measures of reassurance. And they were quite varied. There were codes of conduct. Sometimes they were treaties. Sometimes they related to numbers. Sometimes they were behavioral steps. They were just opening lines of communication at the start. And these lines of communication were open because of negotiations. So this norm that we all live by, no use, wasn't created by deterrence. It was created by arms control. When the Soviet Union imploded, with the possession of 35,000 nuclear weapons and enough fissile material to make twice that number. Deterrence didn't save us from loose nukes or dirty bombs. Arms control did. And we forget this. And we forget this at our own peril. It just so happened that arms control, working with great difficulty alongside deterrence, created conditions for lasting nuclear peace when the Cold War ended. This was an extraordinary achievement. It took decades of work, and it took fortuitous circumstances. It took remarkable leaders, visionary leaders, as well as pragmatic deterrence strategists to get to the place where we could feel that a lasting nuclear peace was at hand. Now, what were the conditions of peace, nuclear peace? Because we're so consumed with the threat of the day, and that we don't even ask big questions anymore. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book, it was a matter of repaying a debt to those who have worked in this field, as well as a baton pass. So let's remember, what did it take to create conditions for lasting nuclear peace? Number one, tolerably good relations between nuclear armed rivals. Competition, of course, but not dangerous, escalatory military practices. Respect for the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states. It took that too. It took the norm of no use, as I've mentioned. It took the norm of no testing to suggest readiness for use. It took the norm of non-proliferation, an amazing achievement, amazing achievement. Yeah, there's still an outlier in North Korea, and there's still a huge test case in Iran. But when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, it had 62 members. What a buildup. What a construction project. It took guardrails against dangerous military practices. It took the acceptance between nuclear armed rivals of national vulnerability. It took force structures that were not threatening, that served a deterrent purpose without the pointed spear. This was created after decades of hard work. And it was embodied, really, in many things, but two treaties in particular that remained in place at the end of the Cold War. One was a treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, that enshrined national vulnerability while allowing missile defenses for regional contingencies. And it took a treaty that George H.W. Bush oversaw with the complete support of his Secretary of Defense, Richard Cheney, and the rest of his extraordinary national security team in 1993, a treaty that actually prohibited land-based missiles that carried more than one warhead, which were the principal headache of deterrent strategists for decades prior. We had a nuclear peace at hand. And we discarded it, or parts of it. And we had good help from Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. Now, the building blocks for this extraordinary construction project, the foundation elements of nuclear peace were already in jeopardy, even at the apogee of success. Because when the Cold War ended, bipartisanship in the United States took a serious hit. The edifice of arms control was built on the principle of parity. And the only place parity still existed after the Cold War ended was in the numbers of these treaties, nowhere else. It took an acceptance of mutual vulnerability, and after 9/11, that was not a basis on which arms control could proceed. And it took the inviolability of borders, which was already in jeopardy, even before the teardowns began. In jeopardy because of NATO expansion to include, as President George W. Bush thought proper, Georgia and Ukraine. The Balkan Wars took a terrible hit on notions of respect for national sovereignty and territorial integrity. There were lots of reasons. I don't have to go into them here. But these four building blocks for arms control were in trouble, even at the peak of its success. And then came along individuals who chose to discard treaties because they were inconvenient. And when George W. Bush discarded the ABM treaty, Vladimir Putin discarded Bush's father's treaty with its prohibition on land-based missiles. Other treaties started to unravel very quickly. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty started to unravel. It was very inconvenient to Putin. And when George W. Bush announced his intention to expand NATO even further, to include Ukraine and Georgia, Putin did three things. He authorized his general staff to test a missile that was in direct violation of the treaty that started this wonderful cascade of success that Gorbachev and Reagan signed, banning treaties of intermediate range. Well, the Soviet general staff wanted them. Gorbachev said no, Putin said yes. And that flight testing began in 2007. And Putin's army headed toward Tbilisi, and Georgia wasn't going to be a part of NATO. And then, after a revolution threatening Russia's hold on Ukraine, he initiated hybrid warfare and annexed Crimea. And all of a sudden, the enterprise of arms control is just reeling from teardowns. teardowns that accelerated when Putin was paired with Donald Trump. What do we do about it now? We can't end the arc of this story on a terrible note, a pessimistic note. I don't think it's warranted. I think arms control will revive because our lives depend on it. And sooner or later, the United States, China, Russia, India, and Pakistan are going to have national leaders that recognize that deterrence by itself doesn't provide for public safety. It's too damn dangerous. And they're going to have to come up with methods of reassurance, just as previous generations have. There's going to have to be a rebuild. It's a multi-generational effort, but we have the building blocks for it. Think about this. We have this foundational norm of no use, and we have the norm of no testing. And every day that passes with these norms intact is a success story that makes it harder for a leader to break these norms. We have the norm, whether we like it or not, of national vulnerability. Whether there's an ABM treaty in place or not, nuclear armed rivals are vulnerable, and they can't do anything to stop it, no matter how much they spend on national missile defenses. We can build on that. But we have to pursue behavioral arms control, first and foremost, because dangerous military practices are on the rise. In all four pairings of nuclear armed rivals, that is job one. A norm-based approach to reducing nuclear danger. And we're also going to have to get creative. We're going to have to become less formal, more informal. There are going to be more seats at the table. I can guarantee you that. We're going to have to be creative about the forums that we pursue this agenda from. And I'm afraid, because of the speed of the Chinese modernization program, we also have to start thinking right away about trilateral arms control. Really hard problem. And I don't envy those who will have to tackle it. But I got to tell you, and Barry can tell you, and everybody who has worked on this set of issues in the past, people who are no longer with us, who accomplished great things, people who are still with us, who have accomplished great things, they will all tell you that we can succeed at this if we apply ourselves. We have the talent, young talent, to apply to this problem. We can rebuild, just like those before us rebuilt.
Michael Crapon, thank you as always for that. Joan Rolfing, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you. Sorry, looking for my mute key there. So Michael, thank you for that incredible talk, giving us insight into your book. I want to say, first of all, what a privilege it is to be here and share this discussion with you, and share my view that this book is really a gift to our entire community. But more than that, anybody who cares about the nuclear piece has an interest in reading your book. It is a comprehensive diplomatic history of the series of arms control negotiations, but more than that, more than just a cut and dry history. You've given it life and context by describing really this arc, the beginning, the apogee, the decline, but giving us hope at the end that this is not an impossible challenge ahead of us. You also talk about the book repaying a debt to the remarkable individuals who conceptualized and then practiced the diplomacy of nuclear arms control. And part of your motivation in writing this book was to honor them and make sure that their stories were told. But I think we need to honor you too, not only for your contribution to that history, but for the retelling of this history that is so important to pass on to the rising generation. This is a multi-generational challenge we face, and we need the next generation to step up and take the baton from all of us who've been toiling in these trenches for so many years. So my deepest thanks to you for this contribution. I have a lot of questions. We won't have time to get through all of them, but let me start with, I would really love to unpack some of what you observe in the final chapter of the book about the revival of arms control. I think, as you aptly described, we're at a moment where many people are feeling like this is a hopeless task. Arms control is dead. It's going to be impossible to revive for the reasons you discussed, the deeply partisan divide in our own country, the increasing complexity of the pairs of four nuclear adversaries, the two triangles. With all of this complexity, why do you believe arms control is still feasible? And where do we start on that journey?
Thank you for those kind words, Joan. What you and others have done at the Nuclear Threat Initiative just stuns me. You're a hub of new thinking, creative thinking. You're at the forward edge. I so admire your work.
Thank you.
I think we start where Kennedy and Khrushchev started. Regrettably, you have to go back there. We start with a recognition that serious crises lie ahead. Unless nuclear armed rivals take codes of conduct seriously, unless they take dangerous military practices seriously, unless they take playing with fire in the most sensitive locales seriously. And if not, then leaders will find themselves in the jaws of a terrible crisis with circumstances they can barely control. And Kennedy and Khrushchev totally got it after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis had, as so many things in our world do, had countervailing effects. I mean, the arms race sped up. But channels of communication opened. And Kennedy and Khrushchev didn't have to rely on Western Union to get messages through. They built a hotline, and then they improved it. They also were seized with the need to do something constructive, to signal their own people, to give them a sense of reassurance, to go alongside deterrence, which at that time was equated with atmospheric nuclear testing. And so they, in 10 days' time, 10 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, they finished up a treaty banning atmospheric tests. I think the process of revival begins with the recognition, my God, we're heading into dangerous territory. And I know the circuits are full, and I know we have so much else to worry about. But we have to get a handle on this. We leaders have to get a handle on this. And if the current crop of leaders don't come to this conclusion, I'm convinced Biden is. I'm not sure what she is prepared to risk over Taiwan. Maybe he will come to this conclusion. I know Putin cannot afford to compete, although he'll spend money to compete. If this group of leaders in India and Pakistan as well, if they can't figure this out, well, leaders change, political parties change. What we learned from the Cold War is that opportunities present themselves, and sometimes dawn follows darkness. This is a crazy business we're in, Joan, where Archimedean principles and Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion apply. I mean, there are actions and there are reactions. And sometimes when we're in the dumps, lo and behold, success is just around the corner and we don't see it at the time. We have to be open to success. We have to be open to optimism here. If we're not, we're cooked.
So, Michael, it's really interesting to me to hear you go all the way back to Kennedy and Khrushchev and, back to the beginning, so to speak, of when we began the practice of arms control. And it strikes me that circumstances are different today in some notable and important ways that raise the level of the challenge here. Unlike in that period of the early 60s, where there was a palpable sense of the danger among our publics, there was still a relatively recent memory of the devastation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We had atmospheric tests happening, creating political pressure on the president. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which made this so vivid for people. But I feel like today, one of the big challenges that there are multiple challenges. You already described the shift in mindsets with respect to the lack of appreciation for the role of arms control in providing our security and in stabilizing the instability or the dangers, rather, of nuclear deterrence. But, how ironic that the apogee of arms control was the first President Bush, and the depth, the plummet began on his son's watch. It's a Greek tragedy, I guess, this story that we're observing. But we've now arrived at a place where not only is there a different prevailing mindset where arms control, in the political sphere, where arms control is devalued, we have publics that by and large are completely unaware of the nuclear threat. And so there's not the kind of accountability mechanism that existed when Kennedy and Khrushchev began this journey. And I'm wondering if you have views on how we can help accelerate or rebuild the understanding we need to create a sense of political necessity. Or do you think that's not important? I guess that's the other part of the question.
I do believe that our work requires public accessibility and strong public support. We need other things as well. I'm going to put in a plug to both Stimson and NTI and all of our brothers and sisters. The flight of philanthropy from this space, I find so painful. I understand why it's going elsewhere, and I believe in the causes that are being better funded than us. But everything else depends on our cause succeeding. So that's a problem too. But I'm going to take you back, John, to the very beginning. And going back through this history was so illuminating to me, because the sense of numbness, the sense of anomie, the sense of disconnectedness, the sense of overwhelm that we face now, and that which is really our biggest challenge. This also appeared right after the bomb's surprise arrival. W.H. Auden, The Age of Anxiety. The sense that the world had fundamentally changed once people learned about this bomb, and how helpless people felt, and how dreaded life had become. That sense, that wave is back. It's with us again. And what woke us out of our numbness, the events that you described, God, I hope we don't go there again. But it's possible. I think the challenge is to be farsighted, to have leaders farsighted enough that they don't depend on a close call. And God forbid they don't, it doesn't take a mushroom cloud to get us focused on what we need to do to rebuild nuclear peace.
So thank you, Michael. Our time is rapidly winding down, and I want to make sure to save some time to talk about the practical suggestions you make in the final chapter of the book about ways in which we can and should revive arms control. And I want to ask you first, you have a really interesting recommendation to adopt a 7-nation discussion to further a norms-based approach to really secure the norms of non-use and non-testing through the 100th anniversary at least, right, and beyond, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's pretty unintuitive, right? It's hard enough to do arms control bilaterally. Can you say a little bit about how you got to a 7-nation discussion?
Well, first, I ought to have mentioned, and thank you for mentioning, that a central goal for me, a vision, And it's not my vision alone. I'm a synthesizer, and I'm borrowing heavily from a friend of ours named Lewis Dunn in advancing this vision. My vision is 100 years of no use from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 50 years of no testing at Yale since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and another quarter century of no more proliferation. North Korea is the last one. I know that raises really hard questions about Iran, but I don't want to go there. I go there in the book, but I don't want to go there now. Believe it or not, these goals are achievable. And they're achievable because the hardest part has already happened. We're already 3/4 of the way toward a century of no battlefield use. And every day is a success. I know if we think in terms of abolition, and God bless people who work for abolition, but it can seem like every day is a failure. I want every day to be a success. So I'm taking a norm-based approach, first and foremost. And if we're going to do a norms-based approach, you have to arrive at the number 7. The number 5 doesn't work. The P5, that's yesterday's news in terms of nuclear armed rivalry.
Mm-hmm.
So I want every nuclear armed rival to have a seat at the table. I want India there. I want Pakistan there, as well as the P5. And you know what? I want Britain and France there, even though they don't have nuclear armed rivalries, because they have so much to bring to the table. There's so much experience, wisdom, practical experience. I want 7 countries to sit together, in part because I can't get India and Pakistan to sit together.
Mm-hmm.
I can't get India and China to sit together. I'm having trouble, the Bush administration, excuse me, everybody, including the Biden administration, is having trouble getting China and the United States together. I actually believe that on occasion, when the nature of a problem seems just too hard, you expand the definition of the problem. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure Pakistan wants a seat at this table. I'm pretty sure India wants a seat at this table. I think it would be extremely hard for China to say no if everybody else is ready to have a seat at the table. And that's the table where we can discuss strengthening and lengthening norms. I think it's job 1.
So you mentioned China and the challenges of getting China engaged, and it's your suggestion of a 7 nation discussion is one approach for increasing the odds of getting China to show up. But in your talk, you also mentioned the essentiality of elevating US, Russia, and China. How do we get China to come to the table in a smaller format, less than 7? By the way, I agree. I think China, it's vital that we begin a real dialogue with China about nuclear threats and arms control. But where do we start with that? Is the 7 nation format the way we start, or can we work that in parallel?
You know, I believe, and this is the crucible that the Biden administration is living in. We have to do more than one thing at a time, even in our space, let alone everybody else's space. And the Biden administration is woefully short-staffed in our space. But I believe a 7 nation forum ought to be about norm building. lengthening and strengthening. I was so reluctant to get into numbers, which is US, Russia, China, as well as the arms. But I don't think Beijing is giving us time and space to be relaxed about that. So we start, I think, Joan, by doing our homework. If we look at the numbers, what weapon systems, delivery vehicles, to use the jargon of our business, what do we seek to include and what do we seek to exclude? When I was doing the research on the origins of strategic arms limitation talks in the Johnson administration, I discovered, to my surprise, that the original US negotiating position was to include medium range and intermediate range, as well as even longer range delivery vehicles. I think we need to go explore that again in a trilateral context, because China has a lot of these lesser range missiles. Putin violated the INF treaty in order to reclaim them. And the US is having a rejoinder now. So I would like us to do the math, to do our homework. What types of missiles with what types of range might we consider being the subject of limitations and subsequently reductions? Dual capable of certain ranges, unless somebody can show me with great intrusiveness that I don't have to worry that a certain weapon system doesn't have a nuclear warhead, I'm inclined to think that it does. Let's add it to the pile. National Missile Defense Interceptors. I think they go in the pile. One has freedom to mix. But I wonder whether or not we can come up with a regime that is numerically based and that is verifiable and that does take into consideration, great consideration, the concerns of our friends and allies, whether or not it might be possible, whether there's something there, whether there's something there. And because China, I'm convinced China isn't going to accept a second tier status. So is it possible to make the numbers work? Is it in our national security interest to make the numbers work? How do we verify the numbers? This is going to take time. But I think China's doing what the Soviet Union did during the Johnson and Nixon administrations. They're building up in anticipation that they can't always say no to nuclear negotiations. And they don't want to join in second-class status. Now that's dangerous because by pursuing negotiations, we also reinforce instincts that are not healthy in China. But I don't think we have an alternative. So let's do our homework.
Very thoughtful, as expected. So, Michael, I have two quick questions we can do maybe in kind of lightning fashion to meet our endpoint here. One is going to be about abolition, and the last thing I want to talk about is hope. I think that's so important for the community right now. But on abolition, you were clear in the book that you don't dwell on abolition because your approach accepts ground realities and does not place arms control, does not place upon arms control the impossible burden of transcending them. I understand that you're taking what you describe as a pragmatic approach, but where, I know a lot of the people listening to this are going to be wondering, well, where does abolition fit in, if at all, in your mind? Where in this story, in this arc, does abolition come along, or does it?
Abolition is our vision. Abolition is the end point, but we don't have a way to get there with 4 nuclear armed rivals and 4 nations that are building up their inventories, at least 4. You know, my colleague Barry, what he failed to mention, one of the things he failed to mention in his generous introduction was that he was instrumental in Carnegie, in the Stimson Center's pursuit of abolition. Because when circumstances permitted, when the Cold War ended, we could genuinely think about making progress on political conditions necessary for abolition. And Barry put together an extraordinary panel with General Andrew Goodpaster, Paul Nitze, and others endorsing the end state. I endorse the end state. But we can't get there simply numerically. We can't get there simply by the abstainers reinforcing their principle of abstention. So I think we can get there if we hold on to these crucial norms, if we rally around these norms, if we succeed at the 100th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If nuclear weapons have not been used on battlefields, and that's the hardest norm for anybody to break, we have a position of leverage there. And our leverage can grow every day. If we can succeed after 100 years of non-use, how useful will nuclear weapons really be? If we can succeed for another quarter century of not testing, no major power, no regional power is going to test these weapons, damn it, and begin a cascade of testing among the 4 rivals. We can win that battle daily. We can win it. And if nuclear weapons have not been tested in a half century, how many of them are going to be needed? So I do believe that an abolitionist approach and a norm building and strengthening approach serve the same end. I don't think we need to have a food fight. I don't think it's helpful. We all got to work together. There aren't enough of us working in this space.
For sure. So Michael, we're in the last minute of the hour. Let's leave on a hopeful note. Your book is, I think, a very hopeful book, but give us your thoughts on, tell us what gives you hope.
I can't without tearing up.
That's so touching, Michael. We're all ears.
My family gives me hope. the nature around me gives me hope. We can do this.
Well, Michael, you've given us the gift of a roadmap, and one that helps preserve all of our families and the nature that sustains us. So I'm just going to hold up my copy of this gift for all of us. Thank you so much. This is a really incredible contribution, a seminal contribution to our field, and we are deeply grateful. And on that note, I'm going to hand back to Brian to take us away. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Joan. What a fitting end to the discussion, but a fitting launch and beginning of this conversation. Congratulations once again to you, Michael. Special thanks again, not just to you, Joan, but all of your colleagues as well at NTI who toil in the vineyards every day and do so much for all of us across the sector. We're really grateful to you and all of your colleagues. And thanks to all of you for joining us here today. I hope that you will take the time to read Michael's book. I know he would encourage you all not just to read it, but be in touch and let this really be the beginning of a conversation, not the end of this conversation. And we will look forward in the weeks, months, and years ahead in working together with all of you to help realize the goals that Michael has set out for us today.